Welcome,
Hello,
everybody.
Hello, hello. Is my mic on?
Yes, it's on.
It's on. Okay, good.
Let's start with why we are here today.
Well, maybe we should start with who we are. Who are you?
Okay. I'm Esra. I'm the co-host of this show. And who are you, Scott?
I'm Scott. I am normally the co-host, but I'm going to go hide in the background and leave everything to Esra.
Okay, I'm fine with it. So you might be saying, what's up with Danielle? Why she's not here? She is off today, just couldn't make it for now. So with Flutter Apprentice Book Club, this stream will be about networking and serialization, which are the chapters 10 and 11. Mm-hmm. So let's start with bringing up the people who is preparing this show with us. And for this one, first, I think I need Scott to do do's and don'ts.
Do's and don'ts. Okay, this is really pretty basic. Okay, treat people the same way you would treat anyone that you meet out in the real world. All right, be nice, be respectful, be constructive. While you're interacting in the chat, don't post or say anything that's adult content, rude, offensive. Don't advertise or promote your services, please. This is not exactly the place to be doing that. And don't spam your same questions over and over and over and over. They get ignored when you do that. So if you want your question to be answered, don't do that. And lastly, harassment of any kind, of course, is not tolerated. Everything from, misogyny, bigotry, all those ridiculous things. And please do remember, we share ban lists with a lot of the other places in the community. So when someone ends up getting kicked from here, they usually find they can't join the Slack or a number of other places too. So we found that kind of helps. Anyway, moving on.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Just be nice, people. That's only what we're asking for you to do. Then let's go for introducing our person here. Danielle couldn't make it for today. Stef couldn't make it for today. Simon and Scott, you already hear them about. So, but we have our special guest, Kevin Moore, with us today. Kevin is the author for the chapters 10 and 11. Thank you for so much joining us today, Kevin. We are so excited to have you here. So I'm passing here. Now, we have Randall here. He is our question moderator, and his official title is the Flutter GDE. If you ask a question, he is quite likely to going to answer you in the chat and grab the comments. We have Sarah. She is the Flutter Community Program Manager. She is helping out Nilay, if you know who she is. And, she is the driving force behind us to have these. And finally, Craig. He is the one that helps us to have these sessions and help us to learn here. Craig, you want to comment? So we are so lucky to have him to help you go all through the book.
Yay!
Yeah, excited to be here, everybody.
Craig did it. It didn't have to be me today.
Yeah, I didn't talk muted, but I was muted and I was finding the unmute button.
Does that count, Esra?
It's pretty close. It's pretty close.
Maybe.
Yeah. So as they've alluded to, today we're going to be talking about chapters 10 and then 11. And in 10, we're covering JSON serialization, and kind of we stretch into a little bit of data classes in general. And then in chapter 11, we finally close the loop on our data layer. So it gets pretty exciting.
Very cool. And when we're done with all of that, we're going to be opening the floor to general Q&A. So word is Simon might be crawling around here somewhere and show up. So that would also be good. Yes. So that Randall can find your questions, put a big Q there. Okay. If you don't put a big Q at the front of your question, he might miss it.
Okay. So we will read them and answer them as possible. So I think that's enough for all of us. Let's go ahead, Craig, and the show is all yours.
All right, everyone. Welcome back to week 6, I believe, of the Flutter Apprentice Book Club. My name is still Craig Labenz, and this week we're going to be talking about serialization with JSON and data classes, and then when we get to chapter 11, we're going to talk about actually making network requests. So it's a pretty action-packed week, if I don't say so myself, and I hope you'll come along with me. So, do you advance? How do we do this? No, it wouldn't do it the way I wanted. All right, so a little forecast of what's in store for us. We are first going to talk about JSON, what the heck it is, why we should care about it. Then we're going to talk about data classes and the role that they play in all of this. You're building an app, you're trying to interface with an external API. And then lastly, we're going to get into a little code. And those are the letters C, O, D, E in binary. Seems like a good idea. All right. So the internet, it's just sitting there doing its thing. And there's a server somewhere. And that server is ready to be an API. So it has in memory different astronomy pictures of the day. And it's ready to return those at a moment's notice. But a client comes along and asks, hey, you got that API? I'd like it. And the server has a bit of a challenge on its hands now because it can't exactly just transfer the raw ones and zeros of that instance in memory to the client because it's completely bound to physical hardware of that machine and other things running in memory, the application that is, that is the API, that is the backend server. So if you just took those ones and zeros and shoved those on to the wire, and that's what the client device, whether it's computer or phone, downloaded, it would have no chance, the client, that is, would have no chance of hydrating that and knowing what it was looking at. It would be the worst instance ever of someone just starting a story in the middle with no context. The client would be like, what are you talking about? So there needs to be some kind of universal format to represent structures of data. And that is where JSON came into existence. That was the need that inspired somebody to invent it. I forget who it was. But it stands for JavaScript Object Notation. So you can already see that it was originally a web-based technology. And of course, websites are always talking to servers, so it makes sense. So we have this class that we've been thinking about that was running on the server, and we want to be able to represent that in a way that anyone can understand. And the beauty of JSON as a format is that not only can any computer understand it, but usually humans can too. So we see here that this apod class is turned into a very simple data structure. And this, we have some white space in here, but this whole thing is represented as a string. And it's up to each library, each participant really, whether it's the server, the client, well, those are all the types of participants now, aren't they? It's up to anyone who's in on the game to be able to turn that string, understand it as an object in JavaScript, a map in Dart, a dictionary in Python. It's up to everyone who wants to participate to know how to turn that string back into something that they care about. And that makes, in combination with computers all being able to do that and a human being just being able to look at this and be like, well, yeah, that makes sense. I know what that is. That's makes it very, very valuable. So that moves us to data classes, because we've talked about this idea that each client, whatever software they're running, needs to be able to turn that string back into a data class, right? It was the server who started with it as a class and needed to be able to turn it into a string. And then the client needs to be able to receive that string and turn it back into a data class. And then, of course, they both need to be able to do the opposite operation as well. When the client writes something, it has it in memory, it needs to be able to turn it into a JSON string, send it across the wire. The server receives that and needs to be able to make sense of it by first hydrating it into an instance of whatever data classes it uses. So this idea of a data class is starting to show up, and they're very, very valuable tools as you're making apps. And so what is a data class? Well, this is an instance. This is a kind of sample data class from the Astronomy Picture of the Day app, but I've pruned the class down to just having 2 fields. So this is not a realistic representation of what we've been using because we've got like 10 fields. But a data class basically doesn't do anything other than store its data. So it's very simple, even though we see that the amount of code we have to write to get there quickly balloons. But if we walk through this, we see that our class is instantiated, and we have a constructor. That's great. The fields are enumerated. You know, we've got final string ID, final string URL. Actually, let me bring the cursor in here. Then we have a copy with method. We'll worry about that later. And here we start to see 2 really interesting methods, to JSON and from JSON. By the way, you can say JSON or JSON pretty much interchangeably. Whichever one comes out of my mouth is like a coin flip at any given time. People say different things. I don't know if it's kind of like GIF versus GIF, but no one cares. So JSON, JSON, whatever. But we see a to and a from method here. And that is the crux of how this data class is going to help us to communicate with APIs, to understand classes that we're running in memory on other computers. And then on this other side here, this wraps up the data class. This is just more kind of tedious boilerplate code. We don't need it strictly to understand JSON, but we will need it elsewhere in our app. And one thing I want to point out here is that we have every field in our class is starting to appear over and over and over again across the definition of our data class. So ID, of course, it appears in the constructor. Then it appears down here where it's actually initialized. And then it appears in the copy with several times. It's, of course, in the to JSON and the from JSON, arguably several times as, both a key and a value. And it appears in it's everywhere. And that's true for every field. And so this is already a lot of pretty annoying code. No one thinks this is fun. This is not why people become app developers, so they can write and think about this nonsense. And we've only got 2 fields. Our actual class had 10. Many data classes have more than 10. So data classes, while they're really valuable, you can quickly see that, ain't nobody going to want to write this. And this is where code generation and a general pattern called meta programming comes into play. And both of these are where you just write a small amount of code in a very specific syntax, and that implies more code. And in the case of Dart, currently, all of that implication has to be realized concretely ahead of time. And that was that build runner step that they were doing in chapter 10 with the Json Serializable class. So Json Serializable helps us a lot by starting to offer this tighter syntax that we can write. It involves less code, but then it expands into all of that annoying code. Actually, Json Serializable does not expand into all of it, and we're going to get to that. But Json Serializable, as we saw in chapter 10, is it's a condensed syntax. We are still defining our class, our constructor, and our fields, but then we just do, we have very simple to and from JSON methods here. And if you at first glance, you might think, well, this didn't make our need to think about those 2 methods go away. So it's not a huge win, but it is a huge win because note that we did not re-enumerate the fields. ID and URL do not show up in the to or from JSON methods. And that is where the win is, because when we add up to 10 fields or 20 fields, then we don't have to remember to tediously copy them into every spot up and down our data class where they're important. So now, I said that JSON Serializable doesn't capture everything. So I'm going to go back real quick here to our definition. JSON Serializable, we wrote this part up here, the constructor and the field definition. So JSON Serializable obviously didn't offer us those things because we rewrote them. We offered us those things. But we've got copy with. JSON Serializable does not help us with that. It, of course, does generate these methods to JSON and from JSON. And then all of this gobbledygook over here, which I promised was also important and then hand waved away. JSON Serializable doesn't generate those things either. So it's a great start because we can definitely see that to JSON and from JSON are going to be extremely annoying to think about as our class gets bigger and bigger. But it doesn't do everything. So that means it's a great start for data classes, but there's another option. And that option is called freezed. And it's a cheeky little name that I presume was chosen to not compete for SEO with that Pixar movie, but I don't know. Anyway, freezed is a class or is a package that helps you deal with immutable data classes. So I imagine that the original name was going to be maybe frozen, because the thing that's frozen can't change, pretty immutable, but I wouldn't want to compete with that for SEO. So freezed is the name. And freezed, just like JSON Serializable, offers an extremely terse bit of syntax that you write. But the very cool thing is, it uses JSON Serializable. And this means that it does not duplicate that functionality. They don't need to both packages worry about all of those considerations. Freezed uses JSON Serializable for the to and from JSON methods, which is great. But it also generates those other things that we cared about: the copy with, the equality operator, and the hash code. And those were particularly gnarly methods. So freezed is a syntax. Admittedly, it starts to get even a little bit weirder than JSON Serializable. We've got this decorator. We had a decorator with JSON Serializable. That one's a wash. But then we have this with call or a keyword, and we point to a class that doesn't exist. Freezed will generate it. We use a factory constructor, which actually points to another constructor. Again, that doesn't exist. Freezed will generate it. And then interestingly, we actually only have to generate, we do have to tell freezed, hey, I want to do all the JSON serializable things. And to tell freezed that you're on board for that, you just include this one section, the from JSON. Or if we recall in our JSON serializable definition, we actually had to use both. But freezed is willing to infer that you, of course, want both from just one. So with freezed, you supply just this from JSON. Of course, this whole API recipe query from JSON, which I just forgot to change the name from, that should say APOD, that doesn't generate, that doesn't exist either. JSON serializable will generate it. And that's it. So we're going to look at a little code now. And this part is going to be pretty quick because I have wired up the APOD class. In fact, we can just go full screen because we're not going to run the app right now. In fact, can I go bigger code even? Yeah, sure. Why not? This may be bigger than we strictly need, but let's try it. Okay, so our APOD class, let me take a step back in time so we can recall where we were, because this is the completed freezed implementation. So I'm going to say git checkout chapter 9, and then really anything, it doesn't matter. Sure, we'll do the last one. Okay, so this was our old APOD class. We had all the fields enumerated on their own. Then they are re-enumerated in the constructor. This is standard. If you made a lot of Dart classes before, then you've done this a lot of times. We have our from JSON method. Painstakingly handwritten. Look at all this. Now you might be thinking, how in the world is JSON Serializable or Freezed going to know some of this special implementation that we have, our unique rules? And if you're asking yourself that question, you are on the right track, because it won't. So there are hooks where we can start to reinsert just these things. If you want the totally off-the-shelf, straightforward, just keys mapped back and forth, you don't have to write anything. But if it's an external API, you don't control it, you can't rename the fields, then you need to do this kind of thing, and both libraries offer that. So again, we're still in our from JSON, is that what it is? Yeah, we're still in that, keeps going, pretty painful. We eventually return an object. Oh no, another enumeration of all the fields. And we actually never even made a to.json because of course we don't tell the NASA API about new pictures. This is a read API, so we never needed a to.json method, but we're about to start storing these in Hive. So we do need a to.json before long here. And that is why we are now going to take our step forward in time again. Check out chapter 10. And there's only one step this time. All right, so let's look at how this same class is defined using freezed. So it is a bit of a doozy. The first time you use freezed, there's just a lot of arcane stuff you have to type. Stick with me. So we have our class apod, and remember we wanted everything to be a data model extender for our data layer. Well, you can still do that with freezed. We have this bit of syntax that we saw in the earlier sample, but it doesn't have to live alone. We can still insert our own parent classes and have those, be honored. So this is apod is now still a candidate class for our data layer. And then we make that const factory constructor. And if I skip just to the bottom of that, we see it still points to that other class. Freeze will generate that. And we had to do all of that kind of wild serialization ourselves, remember. And so there's a couple kind of switches that you flick, some buttons that you press, boxes that you check to tell freezed, I'm gonna need to do those things. And this is the first one. This kind of opens up the whole world of you getting gnarly with your JSON serialization. And then I move down here and we see, okay, I've got a string, and there's a string ID converter right away. Also, by the way, let's recall that in our constructor, I'm gonna collapse this to make it easier. In our constructor, we enumerate the fields and we don't enumerate them anywhere else. We do see we've got some of this logic we saw before, but we're never enumerating the fields anywhere else. This is the end of the class. So that's exciting. But we do know then that there will be a fair amount of stuff in our constructor if we have a fair amount of classes, because that's where we enumerate everything. But we have our string ID, and I have a string ID converter here. And this is interesting because if you remember the astronomy picture of the day API, the JSON files that we were using, I just put an integer ID in those files. And then later I was like, oh, whoops, that should have been a string. Well, we handled that in our old to and from JSON methods. Actually not to, because it didn't exist. But on our old from method, that's where we handled that. But now I've got this string ID converter. That's interesting. If we scroll down, we'll find that string ID converter. And I've written, it's a JSON converter helper for the ID field. We think of them as strings, but the apod API thinks of them as integers. Spoiler alert, it actually doesn't. The files that I doctored think of them as integers. There is no ID in the apod API, much to my future chagrin. But anyway, so at the time, I hadn't discovered that yet, and naive me wrote that the API had IDs at all. Anyway, you might be tempted to make this private because this class doesn't really leave this file, but I think it should be tested. I didn't write those tests, but it should be done. So it's not private. Anyway, let's look at what this class does. String ID converter implements JSON converter, and this comes from either Freezed or Json Serializable. Actually, not sure which. Probably Json Serializable. And then it takes two generic types. And the first one is our internal type. And the second one is the API's type, or just the outside type, the JSON type. So we think of it as strings, but when it's in JSON, it's just integers. So those are those two types. And then we have just simply to and from methods here. And our from method returns what we think, of course, because that's going, get out of here, tooltip. That's going from JSON to our universe. So it returns our type and it accepts the outside type. And then to JSON just goes in the other way. That accepts something from our universe and prepares it for JSON serialization. So that accepts a string and returns an integer. And all of those types, you know, the string and int here and the int and string here, are downstream of this definition. So this is a JSON converter where we are now starting to be able to get our hands on how we handle an individual field. Again, you only have to do this if you have to do something crazy. If you're just kind of down the middle, then these libraries have your back. But we keep going. Date, nothing really special there. It knows how to handle a date time. We don't have to worry about it. This is another interesting one, media type. I have a media type converter because it's an enum, and I just wanted to handle that myself, make sure it was working correctly. But also, there's another interesting part here where the API thinks of this as an underscore syntax. The API is very Python-centric, by the way, the APOD. If you look at its GitHub page, you can run it yourself, and it's all in Python. So they've got a normal bit of Python capitalization going on here. But we, in Dartland, use camel case. So we need to be able to translate media type with the underscore to the capital, just to our variable name. And this JSON key definition tells JSON Serializable, I know we call it media type, no underscore, capital T, but those barbarians use snake case for Python. Actually, they love Python. They're not barbarians. Great people. But for our purposes right now, they're barbarians. And we're going to have to convert our field to that map, to their type when we JSON serialize. So that's how we tell these libraries to do that. And then as we continue down here, we've got some default syntax. This is from Freezed. And thumbnail URL, nothing crazy here. We didn't need a special converter, but we did again need to handle the camel case to snake case situation. And that is this freezed file. This is just a getter. We had this file before, we had this field before and all of this logic. I just copied it over into a getter. So we can see that our image display URL is all the same logic that we had in our previous definition. So that is this file here. This is, by the way, the enum converter. But now, to wrap this up quickly, I just want to look at the files that they generate. Actually, not the freezed file, because that is some of the most intense, not fit for human consumption code you'll ever find. But this .g file, this comes from Json Serializable, and there's an interesting thing here because we can see our converters in action. So this is the generated from JSON file. And what we see is going on here is for the ID, because we specified a converter, then what gets wired up in the generated method is, of course, using the converter and calling the from JSON method and passing the value out of the JSON blob at the associated key. When we scroll down, we get to media type here. This is just a null check because we made the data type nullable. But if it's for realsies, and we had the default here, so this is that default being honored. But if it exists, then we use our converter, and notice that it figures out here to use the snake case key. And it does that because of the key, the JSON key definition that we used. So it was this line right here in our apod definition class back in freeze that made JSON at the media underscore type key be what was generated. If we didn't use that, of course, it would have just typed this. It wouldn't have found it in the JSON, and then we would have had null values unexpectedly. So that little detail is pretty important. And then we've just got a toJSON, same thing. Where we said to use the converter, we use the converter. Where we specified a JSON key, it uses it. So that's freezed in Json Serializable. In the next chapter, we're going to actually finish wiring up our data layer. And you bet we are going to use our new freezed implementation of the apod class. So stay tuned. But before that, it's time for some questions.
Hello, everybody. All right. Thank you, Craig, for the great presentation. That was awesome. So if you have questions, to help us find your question, please do not forget to put Q in front of it so we can find it easily. We will read and answer them as possible. So if you want to get the book, here is the link coming. So go sign up to get the book, to join our stream and ask your questions and reach the code base. Here is a GitHub link for you to go over it. So now let's talk about the community resources. Okay, what to do if you have questions about the content. Now I will tell you some places where you can get help. So if you are first starting out with Flutter, like with all new technologies, it's really easy to get stuck and a little frustrated. So don't let this hold you back. The Flutter community is the crown of the ecosystem. So we are so proud of many kind of passionate developers that want to bring newcomers up to speed and enjoy the magic of Flutter. So I'm going to tell you about the places that you can get help if you get stuck. So here is the Flutter Meetup network. There are now 108 meetups around the world dedicated to Flutter. Check if there's a Flutter meetup or other kind of Flutter community group near you. Some of these groups are hosting book club meetups and they may be able to help you. The link to the network is in the show notes. So even if your local meetup is not hosting a book club series, it's probably full with enthusiastic Flutter developers who will be happy to help you, so please reach out to them. Although there are many meetups and the network is growing, there might be not active one near you. Sorry for passing it early. So luckily, there are also lots of great places to get help online. So First of all, if you are reading this book, there's a Ray Vanderlyk book forum, which is just full of people that are going through the same content with you at the same time. So that's a great place to get help. Also, the authors and the editors are active there. So we have the Stack Overflow, we have the Flutter Dev Reddit, and we have the Flutter Community Slack, which has more than 15,000 members and growing every day. There is also the Flutter Discord. Here, I think we will see it. Yeah. Here we have the Flutter Discord, in addition to the Ray Vanderlyk Discord, which has a channel for Flutter. And finally, here, the Hump Day Q&A. So we got book author, we got some GDEs and developers to help you out. That's all we got about the community resources. So Scott, do you want to talk about how we can support the Flutter community? Because all you know, we are doing this for free for you and you're able to watch this for free and it's not free for us to make it.
So thank you, Esra.
Okay.
In short, what's happening is that we are looking for some help with Flutter community, but we actually already have a few things in mind. We're looking to hire a community manager because it is basically reaching a point where we can't keep up anymore. And we are also, well, we have day jobs now. We didn't always have those. But anyway, so let's see here with the slides what Flutter community does for you. First of all, we have the Medium, which has over 600,000 minutes read every 30 days. Then we also have, as Esra mentioned, the Flutter community Slack, which has actually, as of right now, I'm looking at it, 16,675 members who can answer your questions. This means you don't need to send people DMs to get your questions answered. You can ask them here. Moving on, the Flutter community also provides a GitHub for packages that have no homes because their maintainers weren't able to keep up with them. This way, we don't lose great packages just because the maintainers disappeared. We are also behind things such as Hack 19, Hack 20, then interviews with great people such as Kevin Moore and Miriam from the Flutter team, and Chris Sells, a product manager on the Flutter team. Then we also provide speakers for your meetups and larger events such as DroidCon, Flutter Europe, Flutter Global Summit 21, which part 2 is coming up in December. Then there are little silly panel events such as when 12 of us made fools of ourselves in Flutter New York. We also put on events such as the 30 Days of Flutter in conjunction with the Flutter team, just like this event is in conjunction with the Flutter team. And Flutter Vikings is another great conference that's coming up. There's also the Flutterista conference we've done, which is the only 4-day conference I think I've ever seen. We also have interviews. Jay has done interviews with Nilay, Brian Egan, with Martin Jarrett of Nevercode, and Philip. There are also some videos featuring some strange guy, I don't know. But one of the big things is, of course, Hump Day Q&A every week, or at least we try to do it every week. And the reason I say that we try to do it every week is, as I said, we are looking to hire a community manager to handle all kinds of things, such as maintaining the Medium, maintaining the GitHub, arranging for guests on Flutter community. On Hump Day Q&A. And what we are looking to do, as I mentioned, is hire a community manager so you can really help us out with that so that we can keep bringing you all this great support. And that is patreon.com/Flutter_community. Just don't forget the underscore. Again, it's patreon.com/Flutter_community. And as an incentive, you can become a patron. And I think it's the upper tier of patrons get a private stream with Simon and myself to answer their questions as a thank you. That said, why don't we bring Esra back on?
Hello again. So links to all the community resources are in the show description. So let's bring our available team members to the screen for our Q&A part. We have Craig, of course, and our special guest, Kevin, is here. I don't know whether he is available. Yes, he is. Okay, so thank you for coming up here. Our questions are in great hands. Let's start. Do we have questions?
Well, I do have one question.
Okay.
Did Simon disappear?
Hola.
Oh, there he is.
Hi. Okay. So now we can start with our questions.
So let's see. We have a question coming up. Give me 1 second. Preparation is key, right?
Yes.
Find this. I had it here 2 minutes ago. There we go.
Okay, we have. Okay, you can go for it, please.
No. Go.
Okay, Ali is asking, Chapter 11, in recipe list state dispose method, why we dispose text editing controller, but not the scroll controller?
That is a good question.
Ooh.
And we appreciate all the feedback we get. We are making changes to the book, fixing any little small problems. So yes, controllers you want to dispose of.
And please report at the link at the bottom in the errata, and we will make sure they are fixed in the next edition.
Yeah.
I mean, these are bound to happen, but what you can do is you can go to this GitHub link for the code, and that's going to be updated. So these things, when they're found, they get updated there. So make sure you get the most recent code from the GitHub.
Yeah, hopefully we'll be coming out with a new version, updated version of the book soon. So if you're live, you'll get it.
Good eye, Ollie.
yeah.
Well, and to be fair now, if you've ever had anything to do with putting a book together, well, if you've not had anything to do with putting a book together, you might be sitting there thinking, the writer missed it, the editor missed it, the tech editor missed it. How does everybody miss these things? They can't possibly miss them all. Yeah, you can. Trust me. Yeah, you can.
Exactly.
So can like your first 100 readers, because sometimes you get a report of these things 3 months into it and you say, how did everybody else miss it?
Just thinking.
That's why errata exists. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think there might be a Flutter lint check for this as well. So check out the Flutter lint package, which will find these bugs. So you tell you when you're not doing it.
Yeah, and I will say that was one of the biggest helps that we had, is putting in a comprehensive lint file in our packages. That really helped.
Yep.
Okay.
Const. 1,000 consts everywhere you look.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have another question.
Okay. So, next question. Is there a recommended tool or way to automatically generate these data classes against the REST or GQL API instead of defining these manually?
So I think I seem to remember there might be some utilities out there that generate dark code from open API specifications. Off the top of my head, I can't place the name of them. So if you look them up, Open API is normally what you get from some of these REST APIs, right? They'll give you like a definition file, and then that can be used to generate your JSON, your Dart object files for classes. The GQL APIs and all the Google APIs, there is actually a package called Google_APIs, which has all the models for all the Google APIs already defined. And that should put you in the right direction for GQL, maybe.
I think GQL here is probably supposed to be GraphQL.
Ah, okay. Not the Google query language. Okay.
Oh, well, I guess it could be either.
Why not?
GQL is actually Google's query language for data store and other things.
Well, really, a valid question for either of those things. But yeah, I don't have anything to add other than what Simon said. I mean, there's a lot of the, GraphQL in particular, very good at offering kind of a discoverable, explorable API definition, and it would just be a matter of something parsing that and then, spitting out the Dart code. But I'm not aware of it.
So I seem to. There is some GraphQL libraries, but I don't think I've seen any that define objects for you. I mean, because GraphQL itself is quite flexible. I don't think there's a way of just pre-declaring your serialized objects in that way.
Maybe.
Make one. If one doesn't exist, make one. Release it as a package. Problem solved.
Then we can go for our next question. We have 5 minutes to answer our question, so let's catch up. Now that Flutter has null safety, yes. Are there any chance that Dart will support true reflection? True reflection, okay. So Flutter can become just as powerful with JSON as other languages.
Okay, I wanted to set this straight. None of the other languages use reflection either. I mean, the reflection is the idea of looking at the debug symbols to determine what the field name should be to match them up, right? Ideally, you don't want to do that because that has a cost attached. It means you're looking up every field against every possible combination, right? So there's a definite slowdown when using, yeah.
Now you have to.
What happens when I try
Scott.
to type to answer a question, but my cursor was not on the chat?
Yes. So yeah, there's a point here where it's just slow and reflection should be used. So meta programming which is what is the next big thing for, which is sort of code generation on steroids a bit. It's the best way of me describing it. It's really bad. But yeah, anyway, meta programming is really where this comes into its own, where it's doing the description for you. So it's taking those field names and essentially doing the JSON serialization bit. It's kind of helping along the way, getting rid of the boilerplate. But yeah, they all have that, right? If you go to any other language, when you annotate something, that's what it's doing. It's saying, I want to use this field for this thing. They all have that kind of specification. Even data classes in, say, Kotlin data classes, by declaring it as a data class, you're saying, I want all these fields serializable, right? Like it will produce the code for that for you, which is basically what Freezed is doing in Craig's example.
Okay.
Does anyone have it? Sorry, I was rambling on. Does anyone have any points on that?
One thing, like, because Dart is fully statically typed, then obviously, there's dynamic, so it's mostly fully statically typed, but you can Python has just a lot of black magic that you can get, under your fingernails, or you can get into meta classes and lookup fields and add fields on the fly. But that kind of stuff in Dart is just incompatible. If at runtime a class changes, then at analysis time, it's impossible to be sure about what you're looking at, because the analysis server can't be certain about what your runtime code will do, especially if it's dynamic off of some file that you download. So that's why right now in Dart, it's all of that kind of dynamic magic stuff has to be concretely realized, I was saying, so that the analysis server can know every field specifically and be confident in what it's telling you. And the metaprogramming thing that Simon's talking about is just going to be basically what you do in Build Runner, but in 100 milliseconds, as opposed to running the step and going to get a cup of coffee.
I will say, just what you mentioned there, the reason why things like JavaScript and Python have this kind of prototyping support and this kind of more dynamic language is because they're interpreted, right? Mm-hmm. Even the compilation step of Python has limitations, and same things like other languages that do this kind of thing. So you're exchanging the ease of programming for worse performance during runtime, right? Mm-hmm. And it's like we would prefer better runtime speed, right? So the idea of doing code generation is to get the best of both worlds. You're losing the fact that you had to type any boilerplate and pre-compile stuff, and you get the speed at runtime. And then you're going to get that true 60 frames a second, 120 frames a second from your app, 240, whatever it is, right? Like you're going to get that performance that you need. Whereas you wouldn't get that if it was all dynamic. As we know, there's one of the reasons we changed to static typing, you get a better performance out of your application as a whole.
And to point something out more, it's a little bit more on a beginner's level if this is going over your head. In short, with Dart, we usually try to do strong typing whenever possible. We usually try to not allow null. The question marks at the end of a type will allow null, and you have to be careful that you don't mess things up and cause a null pointer exception. However, that's not all. Dart uses type inference, which basically means that it tries to look at what's going on and infer what type it is you're using. And that's what happens when you use var. Var is not a type. Okay, var is a clue to the compiler that says, I want you to use type inference here. And now the dynamic is also not a type. Dynamic tells the compiler to basically now allow loose typing, allow weak typing.
Allow for any type.
No type checking.
Yeah.
So now the program has to do all kinds of things at runtime, number one, to try to figure out what type it's being fed, which kills the performance, as Simon said. But the other thing too, if you open it up like that, you lose all of your safeguards.
Yeah.
Everything. So you can very easily crash if you mess it up.
We've kind of got off the topic here, but I will mention that this is one of the problematic points of serialization, right? That you might be given anything, and what you need to do is make sure that this is valid content for your app. Now you can make that be generic content. So you can go through and say, oh, if this type that I've got is an int, then I want to use this thing or I want to use that thing. And that's where sort of enums and typing and various ways interpreting JSON can happen. But the point here is that you're taking your untyped JSON, which is a string, converting it to objects, making it statically typed and safe.
And that's one thing, Simon, you just happened to say it quickly, but I really want to stop and point that out. Whenever possible, if what you're working with is an object, then don't use dynamic, use object. At the very least, at least that contains the damage a little bit.
There's other benefits around that with in regards to nullability as well. But anyway, we'll get off topic here. So there's another question coming in. Here you go, Mauro.
Okay, so reading. Craig Labenz is the same guy staring at the last couple of boring shows.
Same
Craig,
idiot.
Are you this person?
I am that idiot. Yeah. No, sorry to be completely flooding your Flutter YouTube feed. But
you get paid for that too, don't you?
Yes.
A couple pennies. Yeah. If you have any thoughts about what we should cover on the boring show, hit us up on Twitter.
There you go.
Awesome.
So
do we have any more questions?
We'll get one more question in from our good friend Tomic.
Hey.
Any
Tomic.
reason except for backwards compatibility? Compatibility? What? Okay, to why Dart cannot fix if child is not equals to null child.
I can answer this actually, if you like.
Okay.
From my understanding, a field, there's two things to this, right? There's probably some benefits we can get in a future version, but bear with me. When you access a field like child, or in this case would be like the widget variable, the widget member variable that you have, you're calling the getter, which is actually a function, right? In essence, right? Which means that when you call the if statement, you're going to get one value, and when you use it inside the if statement, it can be a different value, because the two get operations might return different values. So you can't guarantee that your response is null. However, if you're on the line before the if, you cache the value. So that is, say, var my child equals child, and then test on that. Now what you've done is you've called the getter once, and now it's stored in the variable that's now final or var or whatever. And then you can use it in the two spots and know that it's not null. You don't need the exclamation mark. You don't need the extra null checking. And the compiler can know that for certain. I think in certain situations where things like variables are private, where variables are final or const, the compiler could do a little better job at optimizing those things out. In this case, that's probably, if this was a stateless widget, child was final, it should be able to optimize out the point that you're going to get back the same object in both calls in the same function for the same object, because it's initialized during the constructor. I don't know if that's the case in this one particularly, but yeah. If it doesn't, then that's probably something that you should file over on the Dart team with Kevin Moore. Not this Kevin Moore, the other Kevin Moore.
The other Kevin Moore, yeah.
Okay. I think that's it. So I think we'll jump into the second part if anyone hasn't got any problems.
Let's do it.
Okay.
See you on the other side.
In a bit. Craig, take it away.
Okay. It is finally time. Chapter 11, networking. We are at last going to get rid of our mock APOD service, and we're going to replace it with an API source. And by the way, last time, apologies for not zooming out when I went to code. I won't do that again. But I will talk about the slides again, so let's do it. A little forecast here. We are looking at, this is the networking chapter, so we're just gonna have a very quick crash course into HTTP and how to think about that. If you're brand new, you might find a little valuable information here. If you come from a web background, this will be the most elementary pass over the data that you've ever seen in your life. But hopefully it'll help anyone coming to us either new to programming or with no web background. So we earlier talked about how there were these 4 different things that you could do to data. You could create data, you can read data, you can update data, you can delete data, and they have the rather unfortunate acronym of CRUD.
And so people commonly talk about like, oh yeah, I got this app, it's got, basic data cred. And they mean that you can just do all these things. Well, sometimes you need to do all these things over a network connection. And if you're doing that in typical HTTP land, then you've got a new set of words. And these are called the HTTP verbs because these are all actions. So if you're creating data over HTTP, then that is called a post method. And these are generally written in all capitals. Don't know why. But that's called a post method. And I think it's because you're like posting something to a bulletin board. It's a new entry. Read. Where's my arrow? Well, imagine an arrow. That's called a get method. So you want to get some resource and look at it locally. That's analogous to reading data that exists. Hey, there's the arrow. We found it. I'll come back. Updating method. This name, I think, was pretty poor. It's called a put. If you are putting data, then you are writing to data that already exists. And a demerit from me for whoever named that one. By the way, a partial update is called a patch. That name is better. That at least implies this kind of incomplete modification to something. But a put, you're rewriting the entire object. And then delete. Hey, they finally got one. It's delete. So these are words that you'll see a lot in networking, and they're just analogous to those CRUD operations. You can see them in Chrome DevTools if you crack that open and look. In fact, here is, so here it is. Yeah, so we see their request method, get, but also now I want to talk about status codes. And status codes are a way to know how successful your request was. So you send a get request, post, update, put, patch, delete, one of those things to the server. If it's a get, you're hoping to get some data back. If it's the other ones, you're writing basically. That's all good and fun. But there's a very concrete way to know, before you even evaluate what data came back with the response, there's a concrete way to know whether or not your request was successful. And that is the status code. And the status code, if you haven't found it yet on the page, it's right there in the middle. It is surrounded by red arrows now. And that status code is an integer, always. And because it's an integer, there's no fuzziness, there's no capitalization or localization to worry about. You can just always concretely know what to expect in the response that you got back from the server. And these status codes, also because they're numbers, you just have to know what they mean ahead of time. So we're going to quickly talk about some of the popular ones. So we saw 200 OK, and that had a little green dot next to it because it is so OK. And there's other 200s that are in the 200 block, we say, that also mean various types of success, but 200 is the most common. And people will also talk about, 200 to 299 all mean OK, and not all of those numbers exist. You can look up HTTP status codes, look at the Wikipedia page, you'll see which ones do actually exist. Probably like 15, something like that. The other numbers are totally vacant. You will never see them. But also just most of them are extremely uncommon. But anyway, you just know that if it is between 200 and 299, they call that the 200 block, you had success. Moving on. Nope, I've moved off. There we go. Much better. The 300 block opens with 301. There might be a 300, but it's basically never used. Apologies for how random some of this feels. But 301 means that the thing that you are looking for was moved permanently. And browsers will remember this. They will say, oh, I'm never going to this URL again. I will never look like a fool in front of my fellow servers again. And so browsers will cache this information. And if you ever even try to make a request to that old location again, they will just go and reroute that request to where the 301 said it was moved permanently to. Then there's 302. which is called found. That's another bad name because it means it was moved temporarily. So browsers here will follow the redirect. They'll go get the resource from where the thing was found, but they don't remember it forever. And in the future, they will check this location again. And this is a key distinction for backend developers. Not as important for front-end developers. So that 300 to 399 block is kind of like it's like a scavenger hunt, you know? You're almost there, keep going. Then you get to the 400 block, and 400 is the first one there, and that stands for bad request. Well, the name of it is bad request. And so this just means, you know, this is the server breaking up with you, and they're saying, sorry, it's not me, it's you. Because you, the client, malformed your data in some way, you sent a request that didn't make any sense, and the server is like, I mean, I'm open-minded about this, but what are you talking about? So that's the 400 request. 401 is unauthorized. And again, we're just getting into bad names here because it actually means that the server doesn't even know who you are. And I would call that unauthenticated, but it's unauthorized. That's the name. Then 403 is forbidden. And this is the one that should have been called unauthorized because the server knows who you are, but you're not allowed here. And these are subtle differences. And then 404, a lot of people know 404, that is not found. So the 400 to 499 block is like, things are starting to look pretty grim, but not all hope is lost yet. You could imagine kind of recovering from each of these 400 errors. Then you get to 500 stuff. And 500 is server error. So this is like, they're getting an error alert. You know, someone's phone is lighting up with a push notification about a problem on the server. They didn't expect it. They didn't know this was coming, and they're really sorry. 500 is probably the worst one. 502 bad gateway is another one you'll see in the 500 block, and this basically means they've crashed. If, you know, Justin Bieber tweets about a service and they don't have enough auto scaling and 5 million people show up in the span of 10 seconds and the servers melt, then you will often see 502 bad gateway here. That'll mean something internally ran out of memory and crashed. And anyway, if you see 502 at some point, you're like, uh-oh, I should not keep hammering them, by the way, because they're already being trampled by traffic. 503, service unavailable. This generally means that the API has taken itself offline. Though sometimes this will also be what's returned if the service has just crashed. And so that 500 to 599 block is like, oh, everything's on fire, and it's on fine. So now it's time for code. And this is the part where I remember zoom out. All right. Now I'm going to bring this back. La 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 la. We'll put you here. So, and now let's first of all move forward to git checkout chapter 11, step 1, add apod API. Okay. Oh, it's so exciting. I've been looking forward to this chapter for a long time. So first of all, I'm going to go to the pub spec file and show, what did I even add here? I think this might be stale. Did I add anything? I mean, we added, in the previous chapter, we added freezed annotation. We added freezed itself, Json Serializable, JSON annotation. I don't think I added anything in this chapter. Oh, by the way, in chapter 10, this is how you add those libraries. But okay, goodbye. Apod API, we get to get right into it now. So, by the way, you can see here, I'm also using freezed again and JSON Serializable again. Pretty exciting. They're really, really handy. So, in Apod API class, let's look at how this works. And I'm going to shrink this so we can see more. Oh, it just went away entirely. Well, that's kind of handy, actually. Okay, so this was my first stab at the Apod API class, and it didn't really end up serving all my needs. but it gets us pretty far, and we see a lot of the context that we, or a lot of the like concepts that we have to cover in making a local API client. And by local API client, I just mean some local code that is completely committed to communicating with a specific API outside of our application. So the APOD API, it stores our base URL. And we see here, by the way, APOD API key. I just sign up at nasa.gov and get myself an API key. But I don't want to commit this API key to GitHub. And we talked about this before. So I have a little bit of a question to ask myself, which is, how do I get my secret in my app without getting it in GitHub? And there's a lot of different answers to this, but the simplest answer, at least that I'm aware of, is to actually put it in a file. So I have a secrets file, and it just has the value. But I also have a secrets.dart.template file, and this is the code that is in that file minus the value. And this code is committed to GitHub. But I have a gitignore file in libapi, and this is preventing secrets.dart from ever being committed. So any other developer who wants to join me in working on this application will have to copy the secrets.dart.template file into a regular secrets.dart file and then paste a key into that file. Then they will be able to use the Astronomy API. And this will also prevent anyone who maybe is able to compromise our GitHub account from accessing our API keys, because they will only be on our machines. This is not the most robust way to do this, but it does check all of your minimum boxes for security. All right, moving on, we are using this URI class. We last saw this in our deep linking section, where we were worrying about web URLs for ourselves, but now we're finally using this to talk to the outside world. So I have a URI class. It just pulls this base URL. And then our query parameters, this is starting to get a little interesting. I have an APOD request parameters class. And if we scroll down a little bit, this is how I'm keeping track of all of the query parameters that the Astronomy Picture of the Day API cares about. You can ask them for a start date, and it has a different key. You can ask for an end date to how many pictures you want. That is a different key in their API than our normal Dart variable capitalization scheme. And a regular date and a count. So these are the variables that their API accepts that I thought made sense for us to think about. And I've just stored all of these values in a class, and I'm using freezed so it can serialize itself into a map. You might wonder, why on earth do you care about that? Well, it is because query parameters in the URI class handles turning a map into an actual query string. So our params value comes in, default is not a lot, no values basically. We turn it into JSON, and then we add our API key, because that is how the APOD API expects to receive the key as a query parameter. So this just sets up our URL for whatever type of request we wanted to make. The calling code that calls read just defines whatever query parameters it wants on this class. Very nice. We'll see how this works in practice later on. Then we make our actual request. http.get is not a coincidence. So this is the same method name as the old HTTP verbs that we saw. And then we have to parse our response here. So we say, if the status code is 200, this again is not very robust checking of stuff. Now is it? Sorry about that. But this is kind of the jargon that you have to write to turn the raw bytes that come back in the response into JSON that you can worry about. So this part in here says utf8.decoder.convert. This is turning the ones and zeros of the response into a string. And it is just a string. Remember, we said that JSON would exist as strings on the wire. Interesting. Or on the airwaves if you're on Wi-Fi. although there are still wires. Not touching your computer. Then JSON decode takes that string and hydrates it into an actual map. Not yet a data class. It is just a map, the string to dynamic. And we return it. So this method is actually, it's got some shortcomings that we'll see as we continue on, but this was the beginning of the networking integration. So now I'm going to take a step forward in time, check out chapter 11, step 2, add API source. And if you are throwing confetti wherever you are watching, then that is appropriate because this is exciting. Oh yeah, this is where I had to make some changes here. So the problem that I had was in hydrating the type of response that I got back from the server. So first of all, to make the network request, I just kind of put that in its own method called request. And this is actually important because it took me a minute to figure all this out. And if you copy what I just showed you, it'll take you a minute to figure this out too. But this request turns a future of dynamic. And this is kind of the most flexible thing that you can return from a network request. And as far as I can tell, it's the appropriate thing to return. So we still do this. Oh, actually, yeah, I had to. This was actually ended up being the correct way to construct the URL. So I had to say URI.parse. And that's where I passed in this. I was just getting a bunch of weird errors. It didn't make any sense to me. And I guess this is the way that you do it, not how I was doing it before. So URI.parse, and that's gonna, figure out all the different chunks of here and make itself happy. And then you replace the URI that is returned from the parse method. You replace, it's kind of like copy with, except we're not copying. Never mind. It is more like replacing the query parameters part of your URL with our object. And here I'm just removing the empty ones. And then I still have to add my API key. So now I've made a URI, and this is actually going to work. I make the request. This line didn't change. And this line only changed ever so slightly. I used to have this as t section here. I thought I was being really cute. I had a read method that had a type optional. You thought you could specify it. It returned a future of that type. And then here I would just say as the thing. Doesn't work. Does not work. So now what I do instead is get around to list later, apparently. But for detail, and the problem was that if you ask for more than one, you get a list response back from the API. If you ask for a single one, you just get one map. And this was the core of the headache that I was having. And so I call my request method, and this returns a map of dynamic to dynamic, which is close to what I want, but I need string to dynamic. So I simply store the variable real quick and call the .cast method, which officially converts it in my Dart runtime in our app to string dynamic, which is the magic JSON type. And then shortly, the list method will become hydrated. Flatten parameters, that's not too exciting. It just removes where the key is empty. You don't want to pass empty values in the query string. Nothing down here changes. Okay, so now we can finally go look at API source. And folks, we're here, the promised land. Our API source takes an API, and that's that APOD API that we were just looking at. And then it takes a from JSON method. And we know what that does because we spent a long time talking about it when we were looking at freeze and Json Serializable. And so this is a source, remember? So it's living in the context of a repository, but it's a data contract by way of source. So it has to implement all the things. So let's look at how it does some of these. Get item, that's the first one that's interesting. We, first of all, make our APOD request parameters. And this is where I realized the APOD API doesn't even have an ID. And I thought, well, they have one picture per day, and that means the day will always be unique. That means I will use the day as the ID. So a bit of juggling ended up going on here. This is an extension method that I added to string. Let's see if that'll take us over to it. Yep. Extension apod string on string. So this returns datetime, and it says to datetime as date string. So I'm assuming that I have a string of this format. I've also put such a extension method on datetime. So these two methods are going to help me go back and forth from datetimes to strings in the format that the apod API cares about. Anyway, so that's what I'm going to do for my first request. If I'm getting a single item, then I just need the date of that picture. What day was its 15 minutes of glory? I guess 3,600 minutes of glory. No, is that how many minutes are in a day? Never do math on string. And we get our params object, and then we say api.detail. And detail is another word in web parlance for like, get me the full representation of a single item. So it's a form of get. The other word there is list, api.list. That's get me however you represent many items. Sometimes it's a thinner representation. So the API that we're dealing with here, they're the same. But still, other than the list is wrapped in a list and the single record is not wrapped in a list. It's not a list of one element, it is just the element. So anyway, little distinction that was important. We call our detail method on the API, that knows how to return this data, assuming it was actually real. Then I had to make the Json serializer happy because we need an ID field. So I'll just copy it over from date because that's our ID, and then return from JSON if it's not null. So this is the get item method in our API source. Not too bad. Get items. This doesn't work yet because I didn't type anything in the api.list, but it does a lot of the same things. So we make an API request parameters object. It has the end date of today. And then I just picked a value and say, let's load 15 days. So our start date, and this goes further back in time, is today minus 15 days. And that worked pretty well. And then we again have to loop over the data and copy over that. Oh, this was also a typo. That was a bit of a time waster. I did eventually find it. This should say date and not data. And then we return that data mapped with our from JSON field flattened to a list. This kind of Dart code, by the way, seems really just kind of awkward when you're brand new, but it is, you get used to it, and it kind of starts to look nice. And then our set favorite, set item, and toggle favorite, they don't have anything to do because the apod API is read only, so easy peasy there. All right. We're moving forward to step 3. Git checkout chapter 11, step 3. Actually use the API source. So first thing that we do here is look at main.dart. And main.dart, wouldn't you believe it, API source. We finally get to add it to our repository. We used to just have Hive and local memory. Now we are actually going to read from the API source. And we were cheating here, if you recall from last week. Here we were still loading up those API JSON files. They're done. And oh man, this is really fun to delete. Let's look at our favorites manager. Because, by the way, right, this repository, what does this do? Where does this end up? We pass it to our favorites manager. And I thought 100 times, should I rename this to apod manager? Because it's now not really a favorites manager anymore. And then I just never did. But it's definitely an apod manager. It's no longer just a favorites manager. But our enhanced apod repository is now being passed to the favorites manager. So let's look at that. And it has a couple new methods that it didn't used to have. Where are they? Get apod. Here we go. We didn't used to have this method because this was actually a favorites manager. But now, God, tooltips are so impressive. We need to know an optional day, but we'll just default to today. And then we call our repository.getItem. We pass the date string. First, it's going to check local memory. Then it's going to check Hive. If neither of those have the date yet, because we've just launched the app for the first time today, haven't loaded this picture yet, it'll finally fall back to the Apod API and load the picture. Pretty exciting. Then we've got get recent Apods. And this now just goes to the repository and says, yeah, give me everything. And these methods don't have to change. Remember, the API has no knowledge of our favorites. We can't write items to the API. That's fine. We can still call these methods on our repository because the API source for Apod is just a no-op on those methods. And the next thing that we want to do is look at how our UI changed. So in the current Apod tab, we are now, we pulled in the favorites manager and we call get Apod. This, current Apod tab, so this makes sense. We don't need to pass in a value because it defaults to today. And then this future builder has been here all along. And one thing I want to point out is that future builders, you shouldn't actually see them in your app as often as we are seeing them. And the reason for this is that it's the job of the your state management solution, in my opinion, to hide these futures from your UI. But we don't even really have a state management solution yet. We just have a data layer. So our futures are leaking into our UI, and I don't love it. And I'm looking forward to getting rid of things like Future Builder, as they're currently sprinkled all throughout our app, when we add an actual state management solution. So look for this tedium to go away at some point. All right, next. Oh, yeah. So let's see here. Main.dart. It's time to run the app, which is pretty great. I do need to, I want to clear everything so we actually can see the network request run. So here we runs our debugging. Yeah, so we're gonna, what this is gonna do, we're gonna launch the app, Hive gets ready, then we just kind of quickly nuke our local cache. This of course will be a disruptive function to leave uncommented, but it's important for this demo. So let's load this up. How are you all doing today? You doing well? Nice. Me too. It's pretty good. Pretty good. There's one thing I had to do, it'd be worth hitting. To actually make network requests in macOS, entitlements, you have to go into these entitlements files and add this, or you can't make network requests. Remember that one. Tell your kids. Spread the news. All right, so we have built the app and we've loaded today's, I pre-record these, today's astronomy picture of the day for Saturday. Pretty cool one. But there's an interesting problem that happens. If we go to recent, why didn't it delete these? I wasn't expecting. You all should have been deleted by hive.clear. Why didn't that work? Let's refresh. This is really spoiling my demo of a bug. Is it working now? Huh. Well, we're really just going off the rails here. Hello. Favorites, you have nothing. Recent, you really have nothing. Holy smokes. Reload. Okay. I'm not sure what was going on there. When you are mucking with having a cache and deleting it and you're testing cache invalidation, you can get some oddities, but this is the state that I wanted to show. And let's talk about what's happening. We first, when the app loaded, we captured this page by calling get item on our repository. And That happened right here, basically, by way of the manager, which says get apod. We hop into get manager. This calls repository.getItem. What does repository.getItem do? Well, it asks all the sources for the item, notes any that are missing it, backfills them, and returns the item. Cool, that worked. Very excited. Then we went over to the recents page, and there's only one. Okay, that's not what we wanted. Let's check what's going on there. Recent AP apod tab. Okay, we got our manager, get recent apods. All right, let's look in this, get recent apods, get items into the repository. Cool, cool, cool. Print statement left in here, nice. And this asks each source for items, but the local memory source has items. It has one. And so it's not empty. And so we break out of this loop. We don't backfill anything because the local memory found items, and we return our list of one. Oh, we've outsmarted ourselves. So the next step, when we take a step forward in time here, we're going to teach our app how to be smarter about this. So let's go check out chapter 11, step 4, make data layer smarter. All right. So to make our data layer smarter, I started to think about us needing to know the difference between different types of requests. All of our API sources being identical isn't really cutting it anymore. So if we open up data contract, I added 2 new concepts at the bottom here, 2 enums. We've got a request type and a source type. So sources can either be local or remote. And a local source is local memory, of course, and local persistence source. And then a remote source is anything where we leave the computer that we're running on to get data. So that would be the API source, of course, a future Firebase source, etc. And then we have request types. We might want to load data from local storage only. And it might be nice to be able to specify that. We might also want to be able to request data from a remote source only. This is cache invalidation. That's super important. And then we might also just say we don't care. Just give us whatever, return something first. So that's any as our request type. So keeping these in mind, we can move back over to the repository. Oh, actually, first we need to look at local memory source. And we see that it defines a source type of local. Probably what we expected. Local's in the name. Local persistence, same thing, local. And our API source, wherever it is, remote. Okay, so now each source knows whether or not they live in a universe, whether or not they deal with things that we already have, or they have to go get stuff. With that, we can go back into our repository. And I only implemented this in one method because it only mattered in one method, but ideally you'd implement it everywhere. And that was in, yes, get items. So get items now takes a request type parameter. We default to any, of course. Don't want to make everyone pass this in. And then there's a new method, is matched source. And we call this method before we actually ask the source if it has information for us. Is matched source just lives up here and compares our actual source to the desired request type. If the desired request type is any, then of course, whatever the source is good. But if the request type is not any, then we just make sure that they match. So if the source type is local, then the request type has to be local, because we've already ruled out that the request type was any. If the source type is remote, then the request type has to be remote. So pretty easy there. And now is matched source, we're back in, get out of here. We're back in get items. We're looping over our sources. And we just say, all right, is each source, do you satisfy the requirements for this request? And if they don't, critically, we also count them empty because we're going to want to backfill any information to them. And then we continue as is, no other changes to this method. And this allows us to do, I said last week that we might put some business logic into our state management layer, and that would be fine. Mostly it is just a translator between our UI and our data layer, but it is where we'll start to put any juggling that we need to do. And so when we go into our favorites manager, the name of which is just plummeting, the quality of its name is just plummeting. Our recent API, recent APODs method can now say, how many do you expect that will return? And this is serious state management. Now we are actually managing the state. Before, it's just been such a state middleman. Now, got a promotion, finally a state manager. And we're going to ask our repository, get items. And in the case where we only find one, we'll say, all right, by the way, did you get as many as were desired? If you did not, then let's go back to the repository and we'll assume we had some kind of incomplete cache, and we will ask the server for everything. We're just skipping local, we're skipping local memory, skipping local persistence, going right to the server, and we will backfill into local persistence and local memory. But I will not let myself be dissuaded from getting the latest APODs. And then we return that with some sorting, so the newest ones are at the top. And if I refresh now, unless the gremlins continue to bite at my ankles, we will see recent APOD loads as is. And when I go to recent, it loads them all. Exciting. So now our state management solution is, a new player has entered the arena, because our state management solution is really starting to connect the dots between our UI's requirements and our data layer. We still have very smart caching, except for one thing. We keep re-downloading these pictures. So I thought, I can't exactly cache all the data. By the way, on this run, we never made a network request, but we're still downloading all these pictures, which is just the worst. So let's do a git checkout chapter 11, step 15. That's the 15, no, that's totally wrong, isn't it? 5, cached network image. And cached network image is an awesome package in Flutter. So if we go to pubspec by YAML, we'll see cached network image appears. Welcome to the party. And now I'll just search for cached network image, because anywhere in our UI where we had a decoration image and an image, whatever this said before, now we just use a cached network image. It works the same way, except holds onto the file. If I refresh here, we will see the images appear much faster after they're downloaded once to be cached. Or it'll just break. What's going on? Oh, yes, I have to do a full restart, because we have added cache network image, and that needs the file system. And that is platform specific stuff, whether you're on iOS or Android or desktop or web. File system is accessed differently, and that means those methods need to be registered when the app launches. Oh, what's this complaining about? I'm just gonna pretend I didn't see that. I'm actually gonna clear it. Didn't see what? Gone. Building. Anyway, so you said your day was good. That's really exciting. I'm glad. All right, so the image loaded at whatever speed it loaded, and these images all load. And the reason they're loading really fast on the first run is that I've already cached them when I was developing this earlier. So it found the cached version, and the images just load really snappy. And now look at how great our app is. The home page loads, and image right away. Hop over to recent. No downloading, no jumping around. We are just ready to go. Look at some of these pictures, by the way. Look at this thing. What? Look at this one. That's amazing. I don't even know what this one's trying to point out to me. Whoa. That one's kind of scary. I don't like that one. Wow. Anyway, that's why we picked the Astronomy Picture of the Day API, and it is now time to head back for some questions.
All right. Thank you, Craig, for this great presentation. That was amazing as always. So we are ready for our second Q&A session. So let's bring up Craig, Kevin, and Simon.
Hello, hello.
Hello.
Thanks for having us back. Yeah, so we don't actually. I think we've lost a Randall during. I think his connection broke out. So we're just going to have a hunt through and see what questions we can get from the chat. So please bear with us.
Okay.
It's going to be a bit slower than expected. So we'll try and get through as many as we can. 54. Right. Yes. So we got to this one just now. So we'll carry on from here. If I skip anyone, I apologize, but we're just going to try and race through as many questions as we can and see where we go from there.
Okay.
My name is Still.
Now we have our first question.
Let's bring this one up.
Okay. You want to read it, Simon?
Meta programming as in Groovy dynamic programming. No, not quite. It's not a meta language, right? It's not so Groovy is a meta language. Groovy is you write your script or your in Groovy language and it generates something else that is then run, right? So it's like a build scripting system. Whereas what we're talking about here is it's very similar in concept, but we're not programming everything in a meta language. That's what Groovy is. We're just doing hints to the compiler to essentially meta program for us, and add boilerplate for us. What would you say, Craig?
Yeah, I wasn't familiar with Groovy, but if it's a language that's entirely meta, then yeah, this is kind of a zoomed in version.
Have you edited a build.grader file?
Oh yeah, I have.
Then you've done Groovy. Well, congratulations.
I didn't love it.
I don't love it either, to be honest. Yeah, it's always like how you do something in Groovy and what it means. Is it a runtime? Are you declaring it's going to happen later on? Yeah. Anyway, let's move on.
Okay. The next question.
I'm gonna just since Stef isn't here, let's see if we can get a couple of book questions in. Saf,
Okay.
God, do you want to read it off? Sorry.
No, I can just read it and mention it. So, okay.
Go for it.
I'm at South Africa. Is it possible that I can get the book?
As far as I'm aware, you can get the book online. There's no reason why you can't get the book. And right
Show
now,
the URL.
Yeah, I was going to say in the YouTube comments below or here at flutter.dev/apprentice-giveaway. If you go from that link, you should get the book for free, and it will be available to you until 6th of January, I believe.
Yep. That was a great question, by the way. The book is available everywhere in the world and until January 6th, though. So every day you wait, it's a day lost to read it in this window. The videos will be up, though. So you can always come back and listen to me blather on.
Just sign up and grab the book.
I'm gonna bring this one up. Ali asked a question earlier. I just want to quickly answer it since we got it here. Why don't controllers get cleaned up garbage collectors as other objects? They do. It's not the actual collection that is cleaned up. It's the fact that you have to disconnect your controller from the objects it's attached to, so then it can get garbage collected because it still has a reference to those other objects. Okay, technical thing. Sorry, a bit high detail, but we'll skip on. Is it possible to use grpc and Protobuf? Yes, there's a package called grpc on pub.dev that you can use to do just that, and it works because I've used it. So. By Google, I believe. It still hasn't got web support for Dart, but it's on its way as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, we hit there's a package for that moment.
Right, there's a package. Let's see.
Yeah, if you've used Firebase, you've also used it indirectly.
Yes, I mean, so although, sorry, I want to read off the question, Ezra. I'm just trying to get through as many as we can. The time that we have. Go on.
Totally fine. Okay. John asking, can I follow the book without iOS? I use Windows and Linux only. Why not? Of course you can.
So there's
Good
no
question,
reason why all the UI stuff and everything else, but there are going to be specific chapters that deal with Android or iOS about configuring your like splash screens, icons, deployment, for example, is about the Play Store and the Apple App Store. So these aren't going to be applicable, but the rest of it, serialization, HTTP, UI, all applicable to Windows, Linux, and Mac, the lot. So yes, you can. I don't see any reason why not.
Yeah, maybe we can say almost 95% is not related to operation system.
I mean, one of the interesting things about Flutter, right, is that that bit of the code we're talking about there is the Flutter and Dart specific code, which is shared amongst all of your platforms, right? And in doing so, it means that, like you don't have to repeat yourself over and over and again on every platform. You're doing this one piece that's reusable across all of the different platforms that Flutter supports, which is quite a lot compared to others, right?
Sure is.
Exactly.
And you don't get that
Next
least
question.
common denominator problem that you got from some of the older cross-platform solutions we might mention. Okay, here we go. Here's that.
I'm computer science student in college. Will I be internship ready after completing this book?
Oh, that's a bit, yeah.
We can't say that, right? Because I mean, you're going to have different levels, right, of what is required for you. However, I think it's going to give you a good start. I think I personally, obviously, we can't give you a direct answer to this, but I think personally, you should aim to do some of your own projects to get your sort of a full experience, and give yourself a little portfolio, and then you can show that portfolio at your interview for the internship and say, look, these are the things I've made, and I did this in this period of time. I feel like I want to get to the next level of my skill. Will you accept me into the internship, or so opening up with that rather than just coming in and saying please is going to get you that step forward. Does anyone else have any comments on it?
Exactly.
The personal portfolio, I think, is absolutely required, especially as a new developer. You've got to offer some proof. Could be previous work history, but if you're new, it won't be that. It's got to be interesting items in your personal portfolio.
And host them on GitHub, right? You can do GitHub pages. You can you can do them on Flutter Web. There's all sorts of opportunities to just push links out and get your content seen.
Yeah, really good to have an app up and running, deployed. It's really good proof that you started it and you're really aiming for it. You're pushing forward to it. So it's good to have.
We have another question.
Okay, interesting to read. Why flatten parameters, blah, 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 and not flatten parameters? Okay,
blah, blah, blah.
Let's see.
The only difference I see is a double dot or a dot. Am I missing something else? So why not use the cascade operator?
Right.
It wasn't required, I would guess.
Yeah, it just worked. Now this was but this is kind of a segue into something that Simon was talking about. I'm going to pass it back to you, Simon. Why don't you share the thing that you were talking about?
All right, let's see if this works. So we were chatting a little bit earlier, and let's see if this comes through without too much hassle. Fingers crossed. There we go. Yeah, a bit bigger. Is that too big? Oh, no, that'll do.
It's wonderful. So yeah, this is a nice way to do it.
So in this case, I mean, this was just one of them, right? But in this case, with the question, this could be flatten parameter. Was it parameter?
Yeah, whatever it is. Yeah.
Whatever it is, params, right?
Yeah. Now, so actually, Ramsey says, I've reread your question. I want to actually answer it. And the reason that I was using the cascade operator is that add all returns void. It modifies the map. So if I just did my dictionary dot add all, at the end of dot add all, what am I sitting with? None, or null, void, nothing. So, but if you say dot dot, and you call your method, but in terms of what variable you're working with at the end, if you're chaining method calls, you go back a level to whatever the previous thing returned, and that was actually the map. So you get the map, you call add all, which mutates it, does not return a new variable. Cascade operator lets you kind of skip that awkward didn't return a new variable, or even just a reference to the same variable. and you can kind of keep going in your chain.
It's worth mentioning that if you want to know more about the Cascade operator, you can go to the Dart language tour, and that will give you more information about it.
That it will.
Right, let's see if we have some more questions.
Okay. I remember this name. He or she is joining us regularly. Good to see. Earlier, it was suggested to avoid dynamic and use object instead. Why is there still dynamic in the code?
I love the way you read that, Esra.
Yeah, I was also reading some comments. So Scott, maybe we can also get Scott here.
Do I hear a Scott in my ear?
Yeah, that's why I also had interrupted and highlighted.
Hello.
Right.
Welcome,
Hello.
Scott.
Welcome, Scott.
Why is dynamic still in the code? Oh, I don't know.
I think
Personal failing.
to be
Dynamic is
honest,
still in the code because sometimes, especially when dealing with JSON, you don't know quite what you're going to get, and it's not always an object. So you have to open that up. What dynamic actually does is it tells the compiler, don't type check this. Just don't. Treat it like it's one of the languages that doesn't really have typing. Again, now you're responsible if it blows up. But at the same time, when you're bringing JSON in, sometimes you have absolutely no idea what the data is going to be, or sometimes it can be a number of different things. Again, if all of the possibilities are of type object or anything that is a subclass or a subclass of subclass of subclass, then just use object. It's a bit safer. But sometimes it's not.
The interesting thing is dynamic will type infer in certain places where object will have to be explicitly upcast to your type. So you might, if you have an object, you do as this, right? Yep. Whereas with a dynamic, it will infer the type from the other side of your assignment operation. Anyway.
Yeah, for the JSON stuff, typically you'd return a map of string and dynamic because you always have a string as your key.
I'm gonna say yes, that's totally on par, except there's some APIs which are really, really horrible that return illegal JSON where they will return an array as a top level object, which breaks the it must be a top level object. That's what the JSON standard states. And then there's also some, even worse than that, will return just the JSON value. So you'll just get a string or true or false or an int come back as all the data that you get, in which case dynamic, again, is the only way to solve that. So there are ways, though, to actually make it type safe. So me and Craig were chatting about this. You can passing a mapping function. So your request function could take a mapper, and its only job is to take the dynamic and convert it to a type, and then you return type T. We won't go into this now, it's complicated. But the point here is there are ways around this, but it's not very easy to discuss on the stream. It'll take a whole new segment of its own. So we're going to avoid it for now. But definitely look up generics and templating and typing and all this. There's lots of stuff in the Dart language tool and other Dart resources. So for sure. All right, let's move on. Let's get some more questions.
Yes. Is the favorites manager the right place to put logic if you want to offline support? I mean, Firestore database and loading local persistent database. Copy only if we are offline. Hope it makes sense.
That does make sense. And that is the exact kind of business logic juggling that I would put in the state management solution. State management is your conductor. All the other parts of your app are probably very isolated, very simple. They don't know about anything. It's your state manager's job to connect all the dots. And if something falls down, to kind of accommodate however best you can. So offline support is just a perfect example of what to put in state management.
So, and to put it in a more beginner, I guess, friendly tone or phrase, I'm sorry. If your state management is within a single file, you can use set state. But if it starts spreading, if what changes starts affecting a number of different classes, put it in state management.
Yeah, but definitely like that. Yeah, this is totally what you would do. So you could use passing your whatever is stream or whatever it is that you're monitoring the connection with to your favorites manager. That's done over here. Your favorites manager then just says, once the state changes, I'm online, I'm offline, and return when the get function gets called, get items, it returns database or it returns Firestore, and we'll flip between the two and ensure that they're kept up to date. Right, what else do we have? We have another question.
Okay. Do you recommend use either in the classes for API response? By the way, thank you all for the Serium book.
So this is functional Dart. And there's a package called FP Dart, which contains either. There's also domain-driven development or DDD design patterns that use either.
Yeah, darts, right? That's one.
There's a few different things around there. And basically, the idea of either. So just to explain, this is not the word either. This is a class called either, and it has two generic types, a left and a right. And then the idea is that if you get an error, you can return the left one. If you have your normal response, you return the right one. And it's basically kind of like a type. You bring the two things together and giving them one response object. And you're basically saying, I want error as a value, right? That's what you're doing here. That has good meaning. There's also, you do lose something by not throwing exceptions. If you throw exceptions, they trickle over, right? So you can catch them at any point. You can rethrow. There's other things around where either is an object you're returning, and you have to use it. To be honest, I recommend either, as in either way you want to do it, you can recommend. I don't think there's any particular one or the other, in my opinion.
See that coming.
I really like. I really like that functional pattern of using the either type to catch them both. I use that in my personal Dart, my fluttering. So big fan from me. For anyone who's wondering what the heck we're talking about, I would recommend, Simon talked about domain-driven development. Resocoder is a YouTuber who has some just unbelievably high quality explanations and walkthroughs of all this stuff. It is just some of the best Flutter content on the internet.
Also in the book, I use a result class that has either a success or an error item in there. That's in there.
I mean,
and that's functionally the same thing.
Yeah. I was gonna say it's what I mean. I've been doing that for years with Android apps. Like, it's a common pattern. I was going to say that I've seen some apps built with domain-driven development from Resocoder, and you can take it to literally, right? So you don't have to do everything from this thing, right? Like, it can be to the nth degree, right? So I'm just saying that.
And even he, in some of his videos, will say, like, we're going very academic on this topic, but you don't have to go this far.
Yeah.
But yeah.
All right.
Okay. Let's have our next question. Was that API to do HTTP request native or external?
I'm assuming he means the HTTP library that was used. The HTTP prefix, maybe.
Oh, potentially. And you were talking about that earlier, so we could mention that.
So I mean,
HTTP Dart isn't technically native within the framework, is it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Okay.
So the Dart has a package in Dart.io. It has a HTTP client, which is written completely in Dart, managed by Dart streams. It's all Dart, all the way down, right? And it then communicates with network sockets under the hood, which go straight through. They never touch method channels. It never goes through serialization. It's straight to the operating system. So they are native, right? They're not external. That answers your question. The library that Craig was using is called HTTP. It's actually a separate package. So if you go onto pub.dev and search HTTP, you'll find a package called HTTP, which uses that underlying system and abstracts it away to simplify it. So you can pass a map and it will encode them as form parameters and all the correct URL encoding and all these other fun things. So you less typing for you, basically. There's reasons to use either. So there's some things that it doesn't do, like multi-part MIME. Other ways of communicating HTTP messages that are easier to do, perhaps with the Dart.io built-in system rather than the separate package. But Yes.
And of course, in next week, because we're shuffling around the chapters a little bit, next week is going to be Chopper and Streams. And in that Chopper chapter, I'm going to be kind of going right down the middle how the book does it. Not a lot of creativity on my end for that one. The book's got a good, covering, but Chopper also really expands on your use of the low-level HTTP libraries. So we're actually kind of only like halfway there on how we think about making network requests.
So if anyone didn't
First
know,
person to make a get to the chopper joke gets kicked.
get to the chopper. No. That's my only impression. Anyway,
Okay.
right. Okay, next
We
question.
have still 2 minutes to answer our
Come on,
questions.
let's get a few more questions
Okay.
in.
If I don't want the physical book, is there an option to have long-term access to the online version without having to subscribe to everything on Raven?
I'll be honest with you, I don't know the answer to this.
This
Evan,
is a
do you know?
Stephanie question.
So so you've got
Or?
several choices here. You've got obviously the 3 months of Google's, and then after that, you do have to either buy the physical book from Amazon or you have to subscribe because it is a paid part of the subscription.
I mean, the nice thing about having the subscription is you get access. I'm assuming from this sounds of this, you get access to everything. So you get access to the Dart, Apprentice, and some of the other materials as well.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And on top of that, you can stop subscribing at a certain point. So you're only paying for when you use it, and you can always stop subscribing if you want to step away from your project and can subscribe again later to continue where you left off. So there's ways around that. So, okay. Let's see if we got any more questions. Questions.
Let's get it. If you have non-Flutter professional experience, do you still need to have a Flutter application in the Play App Store to get Flutter-specific opportunities?
I think we said this before. I think this kind of touches on what we said earlier. If you don't have Flutter professional experience, great, and you want to get a Flutter opportunity, then make some Flutter apps and build a portfolio. They don't have to be in the App Store. I don't see a reason why they have to be in the App Store for anyone to accept them. And if they're open source, all the better, because then your potential client or your job opportunity can see what your code is like.
One thing I want to say though, because I think what she's getting at is like, it's hard to predict what every employer wants. So some employers, especially the bigger the company, the bigger the team, they will often be more willing to say, oh, you already know how to code, you know how to build other things. We can teach you Flutter, no problem.
Yeah.
Smaller teams who normally need people to hit the ground running right away. So you probably need to kind of approach expert level sooner in the process.
Yeah.
There is...
Also, I want to add something. So it also depends on what you have in the portfolio. As Simon say, for example, I'm working as a full-time Flutter developer and I still don't have any application in Play or App Store. Because, in the products that I was working, mostly internal, so we didn't deploy it. And if you just show what you're writing, what you're able to do, if you can just prove yourself, then it's okay to not to have, but of course, it's good to have.
And in a case like that, people have said, just make something, anything for a hobby project. The truth is that the vast majority of Flutter apps that are being developed professionally are internal company tools. Okay, I can tell you many companies are creating things for their salespeople, for their managers, for their supervisors, and these are all interfaces. They're all in Flutter. Okay, but they'll never see any app store. You'll never see them publicly. BMW has 300 Flutter developers. Yes, Bavarian Motor Works, the car company. Do you really think it takes 300 Flutter developers to make the things that the public is ever going to see? No. And I know a number of other companies doing very much the same. Some of them are banks. There's more than one car manufacturer doing this. Real estate agencies. So because someone's working in Flutter doesn't mean that they're going to have some on the App Store.
It's kind of interesting you mentioned that because we were seeing those internal products being worked on with Flutter before Flutter was stable, I think. And it's always been an underlying thing because it's really quick to prototype and to do. And if you don't need to spend the time to polish something up, all the better, it just works. It's an internal product. But there's equally we've now been seeing many products, and in fact, the new Flutter.dev website, cha-ching, you go flutter.dev and you can see the new website. That's got lots of showcase stuff and shows all the new projects that are actually taking.
And if you haven't been on the Flutter.dev website within the past 48 hours, then you have not seen the new website. They just changed it.
Just changed it.
Looks pretty
good.
Either
Let's see quickly. Have we got anything else? Esra Kadah.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Some Esra Kadah love.
Let's quickly answer a couple of things here. Is it realistic to create a fully fledged 2D game, Flutter game? Yes. There you go.
Been done.
Yeah.
There's several Sprite 2D libraries out there, including Rive and what was the other one? Flare.
Flame.
Sorry, yeah. Flame. There's several other. There's actually Sprite 2D as well. I think there's one called something like that. Widget 2D.
And these are companies that make tools you can use to make Flutter games. So not only is it realistic to create a 2D Flutter game, there are companies out there making a business out of supplying the tools for you to do that.
Right. Let's final couple of questions here.
Okay. Will there be videos about YAML in Dart?
I suppose the will there be videos question is somewhat in my jurisdiction, and I have no idea. That's a good question.
I found a bunch on YouTube and posted the link. Okay. Now, I'm assuming that they mean about PubSpec YAML. So there's a list of videos there in YouTube.
If it's YAML in general as a language, there's a YAML package, and it's got lots of readmes and examples on it to how you deal with parsing YAML and using YAML in your own libraries, just like Dart does. So yeah, that should be available to you.
And anything you can think of you need help with, there's probably a YouTube video on it.
Okay.
Drop audio. You'll find out next stream. There you go.
Well, Kevin, do you want to say anything about that? Because I'm sure you had to evaluate both when you chose Chopper.
Yeah, when I did it, I didn't look too much at Dio, but Chopper was just because I'm come from the Android world and just really liked it and stuff. So
okay, both viable.
Yeah,
definitely.
Cool.
Right, I think that kind of wraps it up for now. Thank you everyone for joining us. Don't forget, next week is chapters 12 and 14, so go read those now. That's your homework. We haven't skipped 13. 13 will be the next episode after that, state management. We've changed the order of the playlist. If you've saved some reminders and everything else, they'll all still be okay. But the YouTube playlist has been updated with all new thumbnails and titles and everything, so you can follow along. So yeah, next week is 12 and 14. The week after that is 13, and we then have Firebase and deployment after that. Hopefully your apps are coming along really well, and we'll see you next week.
And a few of us won't be here next week because of a holiday in the U.S. But
I won't be here next week.
By the way, Bruno, good luck with those interviews.
Yeah.
Okay.
So. We'll see you next week, and have a good week. Bye.
Bye.